In 1852, in the midst of the Victorian Era, the officers of the British Bombay Army in India received a highly unusual request. One of their soldiers, a man by the name of Richard Francis Burton, was requesting a leave of absence in order to attempt to undertake the Hajj, the sacred Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. The problem was that Richard Francis Burton was not a Muslim, he was not Arabic, and he was not of Muslim descent. Instead, he was a Briton who had grown up in the British Empire and flirted with high European society. A man like Richard Francis Burton would never be allowed to enter Mecca. Indeed, a man like Burton would not even be allowed to step foot onto the Arabian Peninsula. If Burton was discovered masquerading as a Muslim, he would be killed on the spot. And if he was lucky, his traveling companions would strike him down swiftly in a fit of rage. If he was unlucky, he would be locked away and tortured before eventually being executed for his insolence. But he had been preparing for this trip for years. He knew the risks and was confident in his own abilities to the point where he brushed them aside. There is perhaps only one person in the world who could transform himself into a convincing Muslim when he was not, and that person was Richard Francis Burton. Burton was a remarkable man with an eye for detail that is unrivaled in history. He spoke over 25 languages fluently, including Arabic, Farsi, Hebrew, Pashto, and Urdu. He had been carefully studying and immersing himself in Muslim culture in preparation for his deception. So when his commanding officers received his request to leave on a fool's errand to Mecca, they agreed to let him go. Burton's journey was being supported by numerous interested parties back in London who were fascinated to learn the inner workings of the mysterious Muslim culture. In 1853, Burton embedded himself in a Muslim caravan traveling to Mecca. When questioned about his background, he told them that he was a Sunni sheikh, a doctor, magician, and dervish. To increase the power of the illusion, Burton was accompanied by an enslaved Indian boy named Noor. The audacity and sheer confidence that was required to masquerade as a Sunni sheikh in this environment are breathtaking. Burton's disguise was impeccable, and he was never called into doubt. It was said that when Burton could recite large swaths of the Quran from memory in classical Arabic. Burton had spent months in the sun and used oils to darken his skin. He learned the most minute and obscure mannerisms, symbols, and phrases in order to seamlessly blend in. Burton observed Ramadan in June while in Egypt, being sure to follow the traditions and requirements to the highest standards. But while on his long journey, despite his careful attention to detail, it was suggested that Burton's cover was nearly blown when he lifted his robes to urinate in the style of a European, a minor slip of the mind that allegedly nearly derailed the whole endeavor. Arabs typically squatted down to pee in the sand rather than risk messing up their robes. The legend goes that Burton was spotted by a young boy who cried out, and to keep his cover, Burton killed him. The story was never corroborated, and Burton vehemently denied it for years. Eventually, he got so tired of defending against this rumor that he instead began to mock his detractors. A priest once solemnly approached him and asked how he could live with himself in the sight of God after killing a boy, and Burton reportedly replied, quote, "Sir, I am proud to say that I have committed every sin in the Decalogue, that is, the 10 Commandments." Despite the rumors and the hardships of blending in during Ramadan and traveling through the deserts of Arabia, in September of 1853, Burton improbably entered the city of Mecca as a complete outsider and in heavy disguise. Burton wrote of his experience saying, quote, "First, I did the circumambulation of the Haram, and next morning I was admitted to the house of our Lord. We went to the holy well Zemzem, the holy water of Mecca, and then to the Kaaba, in which is inserted the famous black stone where they say a prayer for the unity of Allah. Then I performed the 7 circuits round the Kaaba, called the Tawaf, and then I managed to have a way pushed for me through the immense crowd to kiss it. And while kissing it and rubbing hands and forehead upon it, I narrowly observed it and came away persuaded that it was an aerolite. It is curious that almost all agree upon one point, namely that the stone is volcanic. Ali Bey calls it mineralogically a block of volcanic basalt whose circumference is sprinkled with little crystals, pointed and straw-like, with roams of tile-red feldspath upon a dark ground like velvet or charcoal, except for one of its protuberances, which is reddish. It is also described as a lava containing several small extraneous particles of whitish and a yellowish substance. Burton made sure to keep detailed notes, and at one point, his studious note-taking nearly ruined his disguise. He had trained himself to write under the table or beneath the skirts of his robes. At one point, his scientific instruments and pens rose suspicion, and he was questioned by officials in Mecca who could find no fault in him. Burton writes of that experience, saying, "A crowd stood gathered round the Kaaba, and I, having no wish to stand bareheaded and barefooted in the midday September sun, at the cry of one, 'Open a path for the Haji,' who would enter the house, the gazers made way, and 2 stout Meccans, who stood below the door, raised me in their arms, whilst a third drew me in from above the building, and at the entrance I was accosted by several officials, dark-looking Meccans, of whom the blackest and plainest was a youth of the Benil Shabah family, the true blood of El Hejah. He held in his hand a large silver-gilt padlock of the Kaaba, and presently, taking his seat upon a kind of wooden press in the left corner of the hall, he officially inquired my name, nation, and other particulars of my character. The replies were satisfactory, and the boy Mohammed was authoritatively ordered to conduct me round the building and to recite the prayers. I will not deny that, looking at the windowless walls, the officials at the door, and a crowd of excited fanatics below, my feelings were of the trapped rat description. A blunder, a hasty action, a misjudged word, a prayer or bow not strictly with the right shibboleth, and my bones would have whitened the desert sand. This did not, however, prevent my carefully observing the scene during our long prayer, and making a rough plan with a pencil upon my white ihram. Burton wrote a 3-volume account of his journey, which became a sensational hit back in Europe. After his journey was finished, Burton was compelled to return to his post with the Bombay Army. Upon his return, Burton applied to be tested in Arabic so that he could be certified and qualify for new posts within the British East India Company. It seemed like a natural next step in his career, and no one was more qualified than Burton. But due to petty grievances, Burton's examiner, a man by the name of Robert Lambert Playfair, failed him. Despite living amongst Muslims for months and being able to converse, read, write, and recite in Arabic, Playfair recommended that Burton be failed by the commission. George Badger, another examiner in the East India Company, wrote to Burton with regret, saying, quote, "After looking it over, I sent them back to Playfair with a note eulogizing your attainments, remarking on the absurdity of the Bombay Committee being made to judge your proficiency, inasmuch as I did not believe that any of them possessed a tithe of the knowledge of Arabic as you did." This is the perfect microcosm of the strange and wonderful life of Richard Francis Burton. Burton was capable of achieving incredible things, but he was utterly unable to cultivate the adoration, respect, and acceptance of his peers. He was always an outsider, looking for affirmation, and utterly unable to find it. It is a strange curse that would follow him unto his dying day. This tension between Burton's greatness and Burton's unlikability was the central theme of his life, and it was just as baffling to him as it is to later observers. Burton was a complex man with numerous flaws and an open disdain for tradition and etiquette. So how does a person end up like Richard Francis Burton? How does one learn 25 different languages? Where did his wanderlust come from? And why did everyone seem to hate him? What was Burton's overall legacy? Because while the adventure to Mecca was a sensational success, it was not the only one that Burton achieved. In fact, he would go on to achieve more than any of his peers by accumulating a pile of accolades and daring exploits that remain impressive to this day. There are many strange and wonderful lives of Richard Francis Burton, and this covers but a fraction of them. Hello and welcome. My name is Grant Piper, and you are listening to yet another episode of Forgotten and Found, a history podcast. Richard Francis Burton stands out on the pages of history as one of the last true Renaissance men. Burton's life would take him to some of the most interesting and remote places on Earth, and he cultivated numerous feuds and rivalries that would hound him like a rabid dog. Burton had a unique ability to both shock and delight his peers and his nation. And for every triumph that Burton brought back to London, he seemed to counterbalance it with a healthy dose of scandal or shame. Richard Francis Burton had a knack for adventure and a mind for things that most people would never consider. He was a husband, linguist, translator, explorer, soldier, and scholar. But he was also accused of being brash, arrogant, cold, incompetent, a tyrant, and a mutineer. So who exactly was Richard Francis Burton? Does anyone really know? And more importantly, did Burton even know himself? Richard Francis Burton was born in 1821 to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Netterville Burton and Martha Baker. His father was an Empire man who dutifully served the British interests for his entire adult life. His mother was a wealthy heiress with deep ties to the British aristocracy. The nature of the life of his parents meant that Burton moved from place to place for much of his childhood. Burton moved between Britain, France, and Italy on a near constant basis, causing him to feel as though he did not have a home. As they moved from place to place, tutors followed them and nurtured Burton's grand intellect. By the time he was a teenager, Burton had learned French, Italian, Neapolitan, Latin, and even rustic Romani. Legend has it that Burton learned Romani in a bid to make love to a pretty Roma girl that he had encountered during his youthful travels. Then in 1840, Burton was admitted to Trinity College at Oxford University. He seemed like Oxford would be the perfect fit for Burton's worldliness and linguistic aptitude, but Burton again ran into personal difficulties at the university. His professors and advisors seemed to despise him, and they wasted no time in finding an excuse to expel him from the university. In 1842, Burton attended a steeplechase race with some of his classmates. It was technically forbidden for students to do so, but it was one of those rules that was rarely enforced. This time, however, they made an exception, and Burton was expelled, the only student to be punished so harshly. The American biographer Ed Rice would later speculate that Oxford's professors hated Burton because Burton outclassed them in the realm of language. Rice wrote, quote, "He, that being Burton, stirred the bile of the Dons by speaking real, that is Roman, and Latin, instead of the artificial type peculiar to England, and he spoke Greek romantically, with the accent of Athens, as he had learned it from Greek merchants at Marseilles, as well as the classical forms. Such a linguistic feat was a tribute to Burton's remarkable ear and memory, for he was only a teenager when he was in Italy and in southern France." For the first time, Burton experienced the baffling curse of trying to fit in, of succeeding in academic matters, and being shunned and expelled. It would not be the last time that Burton encountered such hostility. Dejected and set adrift, Burton decided to enlist in the Bombay Army in India. The army could always use learned men who could speak various languages. The East India Company was part miniature empire, part international arbitrator, and part administrator, as well as being its own private army. Burton did not want to be a soldier, but he decided that it was his best option. There was the chance that he could even see battle, something that most Victorian men would take the chance to do. Burton's mood at this point in his life can be summed up in one sentence, after enlisting, in which he said, quote, "I am fit for nothing but to be shot at for 6 pence per day." Burton was hardly shot at while in India. It was in India that Burton discovered his love for foreign cultures. Burton was intimately interested in the local customs, people, animals, and languages of India. This set him apart from other officers who seemed to care little to nothing for the culture of the continent in which they were stationed on. It was here in India where Burton learned another 8 languages and became familiar with the Muslim culture. Burton later said that he felt his 7 years serving India were years wasted, but they were foundational for Burton's next chapter in life. It was here that Burton planned his famed infiltration of the Hajj, and it was here that Burton realized that the world was filled with interesting things to see and to document. India was the linchpin of Burton's life. Without it, he never would have embarked on the path that he did. It was in India that Burton developed a fascination with religion. first with the Hindu religions and then with Islam. But Burton was not religious himself. He was an ardent atheist who valued religion for its cultural but not its divine power. He was both respectful and irreverent when it came to faith. He was respectful to practitioners when he was in their presence, and then disparaging and skeptical in his own private dealings and writings. But in India, Burton committed so deeply to Islam that, quote, he was circumcised and made a Muslim, and lived like a Muslim, and prayed like a Muslim, and practiced like one. Despite his lip service to the traditions of the religion, Burton never cared or thought much about God, Allah, or any other divine being. From here, Burton makes his trip to Mecca and returns to considerable fame and recognition. His trip to Mecca caught the attention of the Royal Geographical Society, who were eager to see what else Burton had in mind when it came to daring adventure and fresh explorations. Thankfully for them, Burton did indeed have a number of ideas up his sleeves for new journeys to unmapped places. Burton left the army to become an explorer. Being a Victorian explorer was not an easy job. It took months of raising money, finding sponsors, hiring men, and gathering supplies. After that, you had to hope that your expedition was a success. Failure could lead to death, or worse, a loss of patronage from wealthy donors. His first trip as an official explorer, tied to the Royal Geographical Society, was to the ancient city of Harar in Ethiopia. The city of Harar had never been visited by a white man, or so the legend goes. In fact, the legend said that the day that a white man was allowed to enter through the city gates, the city would fall. That never happened, and while Burton was once again disguised as an Arab trader, he entered the city with a man who had become intimately important to his life and his legacy, a man by the name of John Hanning Speke. The trip to the forbidden city of Harar was rather uneventful, but it was a resounding success. Burton once again displayed prowess in navigating the foreign and unfamiliar realms, and he had a knack for endearing himself to people who would usually not treat kindly with Europeans. Burton wired his success back to England and told them that he planned to encamp at the small town of Berbera on the coast and seek support for finding the source of the River Nile. Now is a good time to discuss Burton's partnership with Speke. In many ways, Speke was Burton's opposite. Speke was loud and brash, whereas Burton was quiet and reserved. Speke was a traditional Victorian religious patron, while Burton was an atheist. Speke was physically fit and an adept hunter, with a savage love for shooting big game. Burton preferred to read alone in his tent, and thought the idea of killing for sport to be a waste of time and of blood. The one thing that both men shared in common was ego. Burton and Speke were both prideful to a fault, and believed themselves to be the best in the presence of the other. While encamped at Berbera, Burton's group was attacked by 200 Somali warriors. The battle came on quick and furious. Despite having guns, the Europeans were hard-pressed to fend off the attack by the spear-wielding Somali tribesmen. Speke was stabbed multiple times and was left inches away from death. Burton, on the meantime, took a spear to the face. The weapon went right through one cheek, passing through his mouth, and emerged on the other side. The wound would leave Burton with a noticeable and horrifying scar that he would bear for the rest of his life. While the men were surrounded by screaming warriors, Burton shouted a harsh word at Speke. While the exact words have been lost to time, it was something along the lines of "turn and fight," or "grab the guns and shoot." In the heat of battle, such words are common and often come out without a second thought, but these words wounded Speke far greater than the spears of the enemy. In barking at Speke, Burton had lacerated the man's pride, and it was a slight that Speke would carry deep down inside for years, where it would fester and rot, invisible to Burton until much later. Even while recovering from his near-fatal afflictions, the thing that preoccupied Speke's mind was the way that Burton spoke to him, and the words that had fallen upon him during the battle. The disaster at Berbera dampened Burton's next adventure into Africa. Instead of planning for the next big expedition, Burton was shipped home to recover from his wounds. The Crimean War broke out shortly after, and he traveled to Constantinople seeking an officer's commission. Due to his notoriety and history in the Bombay army, he received one but saw little action. Later, he was fingered in a potential mutiny in which soldiers and his unit refused their orders due to poor conditions and information. While Burton was never explicitly convicted as a mutineer, his proximity to such rumblings was enough to damage his credibility. The military was never, and would never, be his home or his calling. The Crimean War ended, and Burton went back to pursuing his latest goal, finding the source of the River Nile. This was the expedition that he was planning and drumming up excitement for when he was attacked at Berbera. Now, years later, it was time once again to set out in search of the headwaters of the mighty river. This new expedition would start in Zanzibar and follow an ancient trade route into the African interior with the goal of surveying Africa's Great Lakes region. Africa's Great Lakes have long been suspected of being the source of the Nile, but no modern surveys had ever been conducted there. In fact, many of the lakes had never even been visited or seen by any European explorer. After the downer years of the Crimean War, Burton elected to bring along a familiar figure on his new expedition, John Hanning Speke. Despite years apart, Speke still harbored resentments towards Burton, and Burton, again, was the leader of this expedition. Despite that, Speke agreed to come along, hoping to find his own glory in East Africa. The plan was to walk from the coast to the ancient city of Ujiji on the banks of Lake Tanganyika. It was a 1,200-kilometer journey through rough lands filled with disease, beasts, and unfriendly people. The expedition set out with 120, with donkeys laden down with important scientific equipment for surveying the source of the Nile, along with important food, water, and medical supplies. This would be a journey that would test Burton's ability as a leader and as a naturalist. Here, fluency in local languages and the innate knowledge of what kinds of gifts or flattery would work best had no effect. The weather could not be bribed, and African fevers were immune to flattery. For it was the weather and the rampant diseases that took a heady toll on the expedition. It didn't take long for all of the Europeans to fall ill with terrifying hemorrhagic fevers. Burton was bedridden more often than not, and was forced to be carried from place to place as he writhed in agony. Speke famously went blind from a fever of his own and complained of beetles burrowing into his joints and his ears. He was so convinced that a beetle had crawled into his skull that he used a long, sharp knife to try and dig it out, and ended up destroying his eardrum in the process, leaving him both blind and deaf for a time. With the European leaders out of commission, many of the local guides and porters deserted, taking with them loads of supplies, gear, and money. It seemed as though this expedition was also doomed to fail. The Europeans, like Burton, simply had no defense against the local diseases that continued to hit them in waves. But against all odds, just like he had in Mecca, Burton reached the village of Ujiji, and was well enough to order them to press on to Lake Tanganyika, which he believed was the source of the Nile. Speke, however, wanted to go north to Lake Victoria, which was incidentally named by Speke himself. Burton won out, and they made it to Lake Tanganyika, which was the second largest freshwater lake in the world after Lake Baikal in Siberia. Unfortunately, by the time Burton made it to the massive lake, his surveying equipment had been lost, bartered, or stolen, so no good measurements could be taken. Furthermore, Speke was still blind and could not see the lake for himself. Still, Burton made detailed notes in his journal of the lake and even described a large outflow with a river flowing off to the west, which he believed was the headwaters of the Nile. Shortly after seeing the beauty and expansiveness of Lake Tanganyika, Burton fell ill once again, but believed that he had found the source of the Nile River. When Burton was languishing with a high fever, Speke recovered his vision enough to strike northward on his own. There, Speke found Lake Victoria, another giant body of water, and he declared this to be the source of the Nile, and not Tanganyika. Somehow, both Speke and Burton managed to make it back to Zanzibar alive. Speke immediately sailed for London, bursting with the knowledge that he, John Hanning Speke, had discovered the source of the Nile, and Richard Francis Burton had not. Burton instead went to the United States to recover and explore the Rocky Mountain regions. By the time Burton returned to England, the society had been tainted against him. Speke had wasted no time in publishing damning reports against Burton and giving talks and lectures about the expedition. In them, he says that Burton was incapacitated the whole time, and Speke had bravely pressed onward to Lake Victoria and claimed the prize for himself. This ignited a public row that would consume both men. Burton, just as prideful as Speke, launched his own counterattack against him. Burton never saw Speke as an equal, and while he considered him a dear friend who endured hardships with him, he always thought that Speke was an inferior explorer, an inferior thinker, and an inferior writer. Speke was undoubtedly an inferior writer, and his writings, compared to Burton's, are hard to read in many cases. The feud lasted for more than 3 years and exhausted London's high society. To settle the matter for good, a debate was scheduled between Burton and Speke, in which both sides would give their position on the source of the Nile. Burton would argue against Lake Victoria and hold up Lake Tanganyika as the true source of the Nile. Speke would argue that Lake Victoria was the true source. The debate was scheduled for September 16, 1864, and was to be held before the British Association for the Advancement of Science. On September 15th, Speke was forced to sit near Burton during the opening of the meeting and grew so irritated with the proximity to his now bitter rival that he left in a huff. In order to clear his mind, Speke went to go do as he often did in these situations. He went to go hunting. But this time, he never returned. He was found dead of a gunshot wound. It was ruled accidental. His shotgun had gone off while he was crossing a stone wall. Burton found the incident to be distressing and curious. Speke, an avid hunter, a gun nut, and safety aficionado, had never shown any signs that he would be sloppy enough to shoot himself by accident. But with Speke dead, the debate was cancelled. The feud was over. Ironically, Speke was right. At least more right than Burton had been. Lake Victoria is the easiest source to point to for the Nile. Lake Tanganyika was the source of another major river, the Congo. Burton was right when he saw the major outflow from the lake, but it was not the outflow of the Nile River. The feud between Speke and Burton was destructive. Burton was left with few friends and in a depressive state. Again, Burton had tried to use his love of adventure and knowledge to advance British society, and again he had been rebuffed, called a liar, a cheat, and a lowlife. For the rest of his life, Burton lived with his adoring wife, who he had met between his expeditions in various posts for the Imperial Diplomatic Service. He served in posts around the world, where he continued to be fascinated by local cultures and languages. But his love of dangerous exploration and his trust in people had been shattered by his relationship with Speke and his illnesses in Africa. Instead of forging forward into unknown lands, Burton decided instead to forge into unknown works of literature. Some of Burton's best contributions were his translations of massive works into English. Burton translated Arabian Nights from Arabic into English for the first time. Burton also translated the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana. These were no small feats, and it took Burton years to complete these massive tomes. In addition, Burton was a prolific travel writer, but Burton was too candid about foreign religions, sexual practices, and superstitions. Many found Burton to be too profane and too irreverent for Victorian society. His translation of the Kama Sutra was one of those books which became completely taboo, and everyone spoke against it. But everyone did so in a way that it became clear that everyone had read it, even though no one was supposed to have even looked at such smut. Burton lived his life in a cycle of service, travel, writing, and translating for the next 25 years. From 1865 until 1890, Burton served in various places, from Damascus in Syria to Trieste in Austria-Hungary. Burton found the intrigues and culture of Damascus to be fascinating, and the quiet and stately life of Trieste to be boring. Ironically, despite trying to forge his own legacy, Burton ended up doing many of the same things that his father had in service to the British Empire. He was a soldier, explorer, and diplomat. Burton always thought himself different, and while he was brilliant, he carried on the Burton tradition of dutiful service to the British Crown with laudable persistence. Richard Francis Burton died in 1890 at the age of 69. He died of a heart attack while serving in Trieste. While on his deathbed, his wife, Isabel, persuaded a wary priest to give Burton last rites. The priest complied, and this action immediately caused a rift within Burton's small inner circle. Burton was not a Catholic. Burton wasn't religious at all. He was a self-professed atheist to the very end. In polite society, he had said he was a member of the Church of England, but he certainly wasn't Catholic. Some of his friends, upset by Isabel's decision to try to save Burton's soul, claimed the rites were performed after Burton was already dead. After his death, Isabel went about carefully curating his legacy. She wrote a glowing biography of her husband, who she cherished and loved deeply. But she also burned large numbers of his journals and correspondence. She claimed that Burton's ghost had spoken to her and ordered her to burn certain sections of his work. Clearly, Isabel found things within Burton's writings which she knew would further damage his already battered reputation. Burton was no stranger to scandal, and he was never short of controversial opinions or outlooks on life. Isabel ensured that his most controversial views and his inmost thoughts would never see the light of day. She sat on her knees and carefully placed page after page after page into a roaring fire and torched pieces of her husband's legacy. Isabel did design Burton's tomb, which is an elaborate construct designed to look like an authentic Bedouin tent. It is strikingly beautiful, and strikingly Richard Francis Burton. Burton's legacy is complicated. His highs are unrivaled, but his lows are wrenching. Reading the life of Burton never fails to make me sad. He is constantly plagued by self-doubt, melancholy, and rejection. His life was filled with hardships, including injuries and slights, both physical and social. Other men who achieved similar feats lived lavish lives and were greatly respected, but Burton was denied any such comforts. Some will undoubtedly say that Burton never would have accepted a life of luxury and adoration, but his private thoughts speak to a constant bitterness that he was never given the recognition that he felt he deserved. Burton is a sad and potent example of how success and the ability to achieve your dreams are not an analog for happiness. And while Burton's life is remarkable, one of the most remarkable you will ever find, he never reached the heights of other British explorers like Stanley or Cook. Instead, most people have forgotten about Richard Francis Burton. History, once forgotten, but now found. Thank you for listening to another episode of Forgotten and Found. I'm your host and writer, Grant Piper. I humbly present this account of a man far more remarkable than myself in hopes that his memory can be appreciated. If you want to read more content by me, please check out grantpiperwriting.medium.com. Again, that is grantpiperwriting.medium.com. And if you want to support the program, please consider becoming a patron via Patreon. Be good, and God bless.